Welcome, everybody, to Data Leaders Unscripted. Today, we have a very special guest with us. Special not just because of the position that he has within the space, but also special because he's a near and dear friend of mine. Not only is he a friend, but what we'll talk a little bit about later, maybe share some stories about. He actually used to be my former boss at MicroStrategy, which is now strategy.com. But Pedro has over 25 years in the data and analytics space. He's worked with industry giants like Tableau, Looker, Google, and MicroStrategy, which is now strategy.com. One of the passions that Pedro has is championing the 75%. What that means is he wants to emphasize on designing analytical tools that are focused for 75% of the users who aren't data experts. He believes that everyone should have access to meaningful insights without needing specialized training. In fact, Pedro, that kind of reminds me of the movie Ratatouille, where if you remember, Ratatouille was reading a book and he got inspired by Chef Cousteau, where he wrote a book called Anyone Can Cook. And I guess, in your case, your book would probably be called Anyone Can Analytics or something to that effect. Pedro also founded Walabi in 2023. Walabi aims to revolutionize data analytics by providing AI-powered insights tailored for non-technical users. And Pedro focuses most of his leadership on making data accessible and actionable for all. Welcome, Pedro, to the show.
Thank you so much, Marvin. I wish I would have worn a chef's hat and I could say that I have like a little data analyst rat making me speak. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for having me on your program. I've been really excited about this conversation.
Awesome. I'm super excited. So let's just go ahead and kick it off then. One of the things that we're talking about today is how AI is fundamentally reshaping data and analytical workflows. Particularly, I think we'll focus today on those non-technical users. And so why don't we just kick off the conversation by saying, how has data and analytics evolved from traditional BI, which you and I are very familiar with, to AI first approach?
Yeah, we could spend the entire podcast just talking about this, but I'll try to keep it concise. Most people talk about sort of three generations of BI, and for the most part, that's correct. Whether they call it the three waves or the three eras or whatever, but for the most part, what they mean is there was this first era of analytics, which is when a lot of us got started. The era dominated by our former employer, MicroStrategy, Business Objects, Cognos, all these companies that were inventing this space, and that era was characterized by the IT organization owning everything about data analytics, the management and curation of the data, the delivery of insights to the business. It was a highly structured world of data models, SQL queries, etc. In the late 2000s, early 2010s, you saw the emergence of vendors like Tableau and Qlik, which introduced a completely new paradigm, and they unlocked data analytics out of the IT organization and put it in the hands of data analysts, people who were still fairly comfortable and proficient working with data, but previously did not have access to own the data themselves. And all of a sudden, they were very empowered with these tools. In this second gen or second era, we started seeing some early uses of AI in the form of natural language. You had vendors like ThoughtSpot, which was probably the first one that really brought natural language to the mainstream. And also companies like Narrative Science, who were investing a lot, one of the first companies investing a lot in AI, and bringing that to the business intelligence world. Narrative Science, of course, later acquired by Tableau. Now we're seeing what I think is the beginning of a third era, which has really been spurred by generative AI. And the reason I distinguish the eras that way is not because of technology necessarily. Of course, technology is a catalyst, but because I think we can distinguish, let's call them revolutions, in industry and economy when jobs change. You think of the Industrial Revolution and how that impacted so many jobs. You think of the Internet Revolution and how that impacted many jobs. I think we're seeing with generative AI something similar. And I think it is legitimately a new era because of how it's going to impact roles, and specifically for us in the world of data analytics. What I find so interesting about this is there's a lot of exciting opportunities in bringing generative AI to BI, but we're now looking at the bringing together the highly structured world of analytics with the highly unstructured nature of large language models, right? And the key to succeeding in this new era of generative AI in BI is going to be combining the two. So that's something that I'm very interested in.
And I think that you probably beat me to the punch with my next question, because I was going to ask you, what are the key technologies that are driving that shift? So let's go ahead and jump into that, because one of the things that you just mentioned were the large language models. And maybe I think what would be super helpful would be if maybe we could talk, while you're answering that question, we could talk a little bit about large language models and NLP, because I believe the ThoughtSpot was ultimately powered by NLP technology. But I think that there is a big difference, which I believe people should be aware of, between NLP and something that is an LLM powered solution. Is that right?
Correct. I think you can think of NLP in the pre-LLM days as still a somewhat highly structured way of querying data, right? Except instead of having to write SQL, you could just use natural language, but that natural language still had to adhere to a particular syntax. So, for example, you wouldn't be able to tell one of those, prior NLP products, what's the trial to paid conversion rate I need to hit for my ad campaigns to pay for themselves. That's a very ill-structured question, a very complex question. Products like ThoughtSpot still needed you to speak in something that resembled the traditional language of data. Show me a scatter plot of opportunities versus average company size over the last 12 months, right? It's English, you're writing in quote unquote plain language, but let's be honest, there's no business leader that speaks that way. Like, find me a chief marketing officer who speaks that way. There was still sort of that structured language. So now the difference with large language models is you can actually just speak the way that you always do. And these models are very good at interpreting what you mean, or at least making assumptions about what you mean. They're not always right, which is some of the risk, right? But they are much better at understanding ill-structured queries, if that makes sense.
I like what you said, and because I think that that's also answers a big question that I used to have, which is one of the things that always troubled me was, why was it that NLP never really took off? Why is it that ThoughtSpot didn't just crush the market when this came out? And I think that you just hit the nail on the head, which is one of the things that you just said is people don't speak that way. And that's probably one of the reasons why there was such a barrier to entry, or better said, why there was not such great adoption when NLP came out. And I guess the best example that I could think of to describe this to people is Alexa, because that's something that many people speak with Alexa, right? And so with Alexa, you could tell it very certain commands, but it won't step outside of those commands. Whereas with an LLM, it can truly understand, as you mentioned in your words, that very unstructured way in which we speak.
That's absolutely right.
Transitioning.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, you're absolutely correct. There is there has been, at least historically, a wide chasm between the language of business and the language of data. We can deep dive into that as we go on. But you're exactly right. That's been the big challenge in analytics historically.
And Pedro, how do you think, given these technologies that are enabling this shift, how do you think that that's impacting things like real-time insights or proactive decision making?
Well, I think it's important to define what we mean when we say real-time insights, proactive decision making. I'll pick on that last one a little bit because I think that's really interesting. Proactive decision making. And analytics, historically, at least for when end users are concerned, you are a passive spectator to the analytics experience for the most part. You have a set of dashboards that some data analyst or data team prepared for you, and you are monitoring what's happening in those dashboards. And those are the KPIs and the metrics that you know you want to keep track of. That's how the industry has defined self-service for the most part, is the fact that you have something you can click on and filter and some measure of slicing and dicing, right? But if you want to become an active participant in the data exploration experience, that's a more challenging thing for, we'll use the very crude term, non-data or non-technical people, right? If you're a data analyst, you use products like Tableau or Looker to become an active participant in that exploration experience. AI gives us the opportunity to change that, where now end users, again, non-technical end users, can stop being a passive spectator that are just consuming analytics, but can take a greater role in becoming an active participant in that data exploration experience.
One of the things that makes me, as you say that makes me think of is how many questions I personally have in my day-to-day. Because like you said, I'm also just receiving dashboards at the end of the day, whether that's at the end of the week or whether that's at the end of the month. And I know that there's a lot of questions that I would love to ask before those meetings, but I just don't. And probably the reason that is not because the data doesn't exist, because we're a data and analytics company. So we've got every tool under the sun and we've got every piece of data architected. I think it's just because of the friction that it creates for me to have to go and create a report that isn't already built. And so I think that kind of takes us to the next point. How are we shifting from just using analytics to truly conversing with data?
That's a great point. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about this particular time that we're in, where we are talking about a completely new way of exploring data, conversing with data, as you mentioned. And I mean, just think about it. What would you rather do? Click around on a dashboard or use words to express what you're trying to find, right? And there are some very important challenges and important considerations that we have to keep in mind to make that work. But the point is that AI truly changes the way that people interact with data. And we can actually take it further, because I don't think it's just about conversing with data. It's also about potentially automating a lot of the work that has to happen before end users are exposed to that data. Your data pipelines, your data warehousing, data models, even semantic layers. The takeaway from all of this is that AI is showing us that there is a new way to scale. For your viewers, I invite everybody to check out this webpage called the AI Native Leaderboard. If you're not familiar with this, it's a list of companies that the person who runs this website calls AI native companies. He's an entrepreneur. He's the founder of a consumer fintech app. And he's keeping a list of companies that are showing dramatic levels of growth, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars, with remarkably small teams. Like one example on that list is a company called Mercor. They do AI recruiting software. They are at $75 million in revenue. And the most fascinating thing about that is that their team is 30 people. Think about that. Normally, a company of that size, 75, 80 million, you're expecting to be 200 people. So we're seeing
minimum 200.
Exactly, 300 people maybe. We're seeing that the way for companies to scale has completely changed with AI, right? And this is changing a lot of different disciplines, not just analytics, engineering. You see, everybody's using Cursor now. I'm talking about vibe coding. Customer support, we're using Intercom ourselves. So what does this mean for analytics? Going back to your question, I think what it means is that there is a real possibility that the traditional data stack is going to become obsolete in the relatively near future because companies are going to start choosing solutions that don't require a lot of expertise to implement and to run, and that don't require a lot of expertise from the end users to interact with. And that's how we get to conversational analytics.
And one of the things that you touched on was the challenges that this is helping us overcome. And we talked about how those challenges that are being overcome, especially with conversational analytics, allow people with low data literacy to have access and to be a more proactive participant with data. How is this impacting the tool itself? Is it simply at the conversational level? Is that the only challenge that is being overcome, or are there others that we haven't thought about?
There's certainly others. There's an entire fascinating field of research about human-computer interaction or human AI interaction. There is a academic paper. If if you have nothing better to do and you want to read something interesting on the weekend, I highly recommend an academic paper.
Well, I can take your academic paper, give it to ChatGPT, and tell it to summarize it for me. So I'll take that.
It's called The Gulf of Envisioning. It comes from Stanford University, and it talks precisely about this: the cognitive challenges that people face when trying to express their intentions to LLMs in the form of effective prompts. What that means in layman's terms is I see a lot of companies out there making the mistake of saying, oh, I can just put a chatbot on top of our data, and that's going to solve all of our self-service problems. That's not only not the case, it actually makes the problem worse. Because what that assumes is the premise on top of which data analytics has been built historically, that people are capable of expressing our intentions clearly in a highly structured way. And that is just not true. And anybody who's worked with business leaders before know that's not true, right? That's why data analysts exist, because they are capable of translating those highly unstructured intentions into highly structured queries, right? So that is one of the challenges. It's not just as simple as taking a chatbot, putting it on top of your data, and you're done. There's a lot of considerations and a lot of scaffolding that you need to build around that in order for that to actually work.
If I'm hearing that correctly, it sounds like it's not a magic potion that you could just simply say, okay, well, yes, here is AI. It's sitting on top of the data. You can ask it any questions. It seems like there's going to have to be some sense of training even that comes along with these brand new capabilities that AI is opening up within the context of conversation. Can you talk to me a little bit about what that looks like? Is that maybe establishing a common questions, for example, that you would show the tool how to be able to ask from a data perspective?
Sure. So I think in analytics, what you're looking for is that connective tissue between business intention and analytical query, that translation layer that I was mentioning before. In traditional analytics parlance, we know that as the metadata or the semantic layer, which is basically the business rules, the logical business definition, or the logical representation of that physical data and how the business operates, right? What is changing now, I believe, is historically, that has been a very front-heavy exercise. You have a team of data experts, data architects, data modelers that spend a long time, weeks, maybe months, building that underlying data model before the data is presented to the business. That has the value of making sure that there's a lot of consistency in the definitions, presumably accuracy in the responses of the system. It has the disadvantage that it's in that long process, the business is getting zero value, right? Now we have these AI models that reason, and they allow us to take a very different spin to that problem, where now instead of front loading the creation of the semantic layer, you can actually create it very organically as users are interacting with the tool, with the data, because the model is smart enough to reason and learn over time. So it learns how people are asking questions and the terms that they're using, and it can remember those for the future. So imagine that, a world where you end up with this organically created, almost like a crowdsourced set of business definitions that doesn't require that really heavy lift at the beginning. To me, that's one of the most groundbreaking things that we'll be able to do with AI for analytics.
And maybe I'm understanding this wrong, but I'm as you're saying that, one of the things that came to mind was, does that mean, for example, in the future, I could come in and maybe the interface would say something like, hey, here are the top questions that people in your department are asking.
Sure. And we can even go beyond that. So the tool can learn what the team is asking and what are the popular questions. But honestly, that's a little bit straightforward. It's not very different from today, a tool telling you here are the top dashboards that are being consulted, right? But think about it this way. I'll give you an example. Imagine that you have a data set of Netflix movies and you ask the tool, I want to see a list of all of the French movies in this data set, right? What does that mean? Does that mean French movies as in French language? Or it was produced in France? Or it was directed by a French director? Right? That's why a question like how many customers do we have is so straightforward, but also so difficult to use because customer could mean many different things, right? Yeah. So really what I'm talking about is an AI that can reason and is capable of understanding, oh, when this team uses the term French movie or customer, this is what they generally mean, right? And that becomes part of my knowledge that I've cultivated over time by working with this team. And now I can speak the language of business more capably, more adequately, and then translated that into the language of data. So the end user doesn't have to learn the language of data. They can just speak the way they've always spoken and know that the tool will be smart enough to understand how to translate that.
I love that. So then what type of skills I appreciate what you're saying because it is incorporating that context into it. But I think that there's still going to be situations where, for example, maybe it provides you an answer and you're like, that's not what I was expecting. Maybe you could tell me what context you used to be able to answer that question. And then I'm wondering, does that mean that there are new classes and new training that needs to be taken by those new business users that are going to come into the space thanks to the technology to teach them how to speak with the data, right? Because they will retain the context, but I think that for better or for worse, there still has to be some sort of learning that they need to have in order to understand how to be more efficient with that conversation that it's having with the AI.
I think so. I think data literacy, if we want to use that term, is a journey. And we've been going along that journey for years and years now, a couple of decades. The second wave or second generation of BI brought us further along that journey by empowering data analysts who previously didn't have that agency or ownership over the data to have more ownership of it, right? So the role of data analysts evolved where now they actually became curators of data, often curators of those business definitions and business semantics. I think in this new era, we're going to see another step in that data literacy journey where maybe you can now unlock that power out of the data analyst community into, for example, a marketing ops professional, right? A marketing ops professional that understands all the systems that a marketing team uses and knows how do we define an MQL or an SQL in our CRM system, and where are we tracking new trials, and all of those different systems. And that marketing ops person may be empowered to now act as the curator of those business rules. But I think what's interesting about the AI era, as I said at the beginning, is that roles are changing. I tell anybody who is a data analyst that if the main value that they bring to the table is that they're a dashboard designer, they should be really worried. They should be really worried because the value is moving upstream to more of that data curation piece, right? Where you still need a human understanding of the business as opposed to, automatically create a visualization for me which is now actually pretty straightforward to do by AI.
Interestingly enough that you mentioned that, Pedro, I remember when we first started Data Meaning, I want to say that maybe in the beginning, about 10% of the company used to be UI UX designers, because at that time, that was one of the most valuable pieces of let's say, output that we could provide from an analytics perspective, because you didn't have this ability to be able to converse with the data. And as you can imagine, we don't have any UI UX designers anymore, because there's very little value that provides, or that someone can't be able to do on their own from those tools. But it does really pose a very interesting question, in the sense of, will there still be a space for UI UX within the context of a dashboard, or will we just continue having a conversation, given that we're already provided the information that we need? So for example, if I'm trying to find a trend, if I just ask the question, what is the trend? Would I still need a visualization for that? What's your opinion on that?
That's a great question. I think that is a crucial question, and trying to predict the future there is kind of hard. My gut feeling where we sit today is that there will always be room and a need for visualizations, for dashboards, but for specific use cases. If I'm asking for a trend, quite honestly, it's a lot easier to see how a line chart is moving up or down, right? To understand how that's trending, than read a story about it, right? But there are other use cases where maybe a visualization is another step, another thing for me to decipher, when just a very simple answer would be better. And I think the one problem historically with the BI market is that we've become so over-reliant on dashboards and visualizations. You know that phrase, when everything looks like, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? The dashboard has become the hammer of BI. And anytime anybody has a question, the answer is, here's a dashboard. That's not necessary for every use case. There's a lot of use cases where that's just overkill, and it just introduces greater cognitive challenges to users. So I think, I guess I see room for both, right? But I do find it very fascinating to find out what are the use cases where people just start relying on headlines and narratives and stories, as opposed to the traditional report and dashboard.
Well, now you've built up so much suspense that I'm very curious as to how Walabi AI really manifests this within the product. Can you tell us a little bit about Walabi and some of its features, and how it makes data exploration easier for us?
Sure. So the goal of Walabi is to empower all the people that can benefit from data, but haven't really had solutions that have been tailored for them, because the industry has typically catered to that data audience, right? Very successfully. Again, the companies that we come from, Tableau, Looker, broke analytics out of more confined worlds of IT and put it in the hands of millions of data analysts and data engineers who are a bit passionate fans of those tools. And yet the majority of the world, of the population, doesn't look like data analysts and data engineers. For every data analyst, there are X number of directors of CRMs, or head of growth marketing, or RevOps specialists who lead very data-driven functions, but they are not necessarily data experts, right? And that world, that population, is orders of magnitude larger than the population that is benefiting from data today. With AI, we see an opportunity to solve that and help businesses answer all these existential questions they have that they haven't been able to answer before without a lot of effort. And throughout the conversation, you've heard me touch on some of the principles that we have employed to try to change this. The idea of creating business rules as you go is core to the Walabi approach, where instead of having to build or front load that semantic layer development process, you can actually work with the users as they are exploring data to build those semantic definitions on the fly, right? Using AI to become that translator between business language and data language. Think about how powerful that is. We are now in a legitimate position for the first time to truly democratize analytics across entire organizations, because we now have these business to data translators that can scale in a way that just humans can't, right? And for data teams, what it also means is you now have the ability to support users where in a self-service world where maybe they're not answering all of their questions, but they can get to a point where they've done enough work that by the time they get to the data team, they're not starting from zero. And it really reduces the burden on the data team. You've heard of, we talked about the idea of vibe coding, right? There's now, you hear about vibe marketing. And regardless of what you think of the term, some people find the term very irritating. I don't blame you, right? The concept behind it, I find tremendously fascinating, because what it's teaching us, it's that AI is not here to replace us. AI is here to take us a good part of the way before handing the ball to us so that we can cross it across the finish line. That's the thing that you see with Cursor and engineering, right? Cursor doesn't replace an engineer. It makes things a lot easier for the engineer. And the engineer's role is to guide, to refine, to perfect, right? Same thing with the design tools you see in marketing. What if that is the future of analytics, where people expect that, this AI tool is not going to give me the perfect answer, but it's going to take me far along the journey where I can then take over and refine the answer without starting from zero, right? Is that the way it's going to go? I don't know, but I think it's very possible based on everything that we're seeing. And that's the philosophy that we're taking with Walabi. It's a completely new way of thinking about data exploration. But if we want to finally reach that large segment of the population that has never adopted BI before, I think you need a radically different approach. And that's why we're doing that.
So one of the things that you mentioned was that a business user, for example, can begin working with Walabi. It can get them exploring the data to the point that maybe it does reduce or should reduce the burden on the data and analytics team. But then what does that mean for the data team and the team structure as a whole?
I think what that means for the data team is, one, it's an opportunity to empower the business truly for the first time, beyond just handing them a dashboard and expecting that they're going to click on it and hoping that's going to solve all problems. I like sharing this anecdote. A couple of years ago, I was speaking with the VP of analytics at a very large global telco in the UK, and very animated, colorful British gentleman who was expressing his frustration about all the investment that his data team had made to try to deliver self-service analytics, but the return of that investment was very little. And he said to me, Pedro, I have 8,000 dashboards. I don't need another effing dashboard. And he used the word, I'm not using it here because it's a family program. But to me, that was just so revealing that the way to break through that BI adoption barrier is not with more dashboards. So now we have an opportunity to really help make data teams successful in a way that hasn't been done before. That truly empowers end users to work with data, not beyond just clicking on a dashboard, but actually doing data exploration by themselves. And yes, that doesn't mean that they'll be able to answer every single question. But like I've said before, they will get much further along than they did in the past. And for data teams, what that means is just a lot less time reacting and responding to user requests. From a data roles perspective, we touched on this also. I think that means that data teams have to start seeing themselves less as reporting and dashboard factories, but more as data curators, right? The owners of that business logic, the business definitions, the facilitators, I guess, of those foundations that are going to support that translation between the language of business and the language of data. I think some of it is going to be facilitated by AI, And that's what we're doing with Walabi. But I think that for the foreseeable future, that will still require a human in the loop.
I almost wonder, based off of what you're saying, Pedro, I almost wonder if there's also an additional responsibility on the business side. What I mean by that is the business historically was providing requirements to the data team saying, this is the data and these are the KPIs that we need. But if that friction really is reduced, then really instead, I think business users should be asking themselves the question of what action do I want to take from that business decision, and really begin to think about it that way, as opposed to what KPIs do I need, but rather what decisions do I need to take off of that action. To give you an example, we have a dashboard that tells us marketing spend, and it gives it to us by channel, and then it gives us the return of that marketing spend based off of conversions and meetings, et cetera, that were set. Well, if that's the case, and really I don't need that dashboard anymore, and I can just ask the question, well, which channel is providing the best ROI, on our marketing spend, then really I just, that's really the question that I need answered, so that I can determine whether or not I'm going to increase spend on one and turn down spend on another. What is your perspective on the business user's responsibility given this transformation?
I wonder if we are really introducing a new challenge, or we're just seeing the latest iteration of a long-standing challenge. I'll explain what I mean. If a dashboard tracks a KPI that you're monitoring, but you're never really taking action on it, why are you monitoring it, right? If you see that indicator move up or down, what does that mean to the business? If it doesn't mean anything, then you're probably asking the wrong question. The thing about dashboards is they're very good at telling you what's happening, but they rarely tell you why, right? I think you can make an argument that we're going to be in a world now where we can use AI to make that exploration of the why, the underlying factors that are moving that indicator, make that process easier, right? So if you know that your conversion rates are going down, I guess that's helpful to let you know that there's a problem happening. But then what's the next step? Well, you want to know, is that because we are over calibrating on a particular campaign that's not really working, or it's because our opportunities in a particular territory, or with a particular vertical, or with a particular group of sales reps are closing at a lower rate than the average, right? And you have to have visibility into what those reasons are. That was the same in pre-AI, generative AI world, and it's the same today. It's about how you provide that second order, third order degree of understanding to the user that's going to drive that action based on the analytics that you're generating.
And what I like about what you're saying is that I think for the very first time with technologies like Walabi, we can finally push the business users to finally get to that point of action and giving us those requirements as to what actions they're going to take. Given that a platform like Walabi would allow access to so many new users to become data participants in the organization, what does that mean from a governance perspective?
It's a terrific question. It's a very fundamental question for us. First, I think it's very important to state very clearly that we don't think governance is not necessary. You and I come from the era of AI based on that proverbial single source of truth and the perfectly curated semantic layer, and I waved that banner for years. And I still think that's very important for certain use cases. That's how my thinking evolved. The governance is not a binary question, yes or no. I think there's a lot of degrees of governance. And you have to identify which use cases are more important than others. So for example, for financial use cases, it's very important because if you're making decisions about somebody's compensation, or even more importantly about somebody's employment, you want to make sure that you have the very precise data, right? But other use case, for example, in Walabi, we're customer zero. We use Walabi ourselves, and every week we have our go-to-market operations meeting, and we run it using Walabi, right? So we're looking at our cost per trial. or our trial conversion rates, right? And if we see that it's 11%, but it could also be 13 to 14%, right? Are we really going to make a substantially different decision because of those numbers? The takeaway there is that that's how many businesses operate, where you don't need necessarily a high degree of precision, but you need enough directional guidance to make a decision. And when you talk to a lot of businesses in non-regulated spaces like finance or healthcare, obviously we're not talking about that, but marketing, sales, etc., right? Speed and self-sufficiency is often prioritized over 100% accuracy. And yet traditionally, that's not how analytics has worked. Analytics has always championed a very high bar of accuracy and precision. And the takeaway is that that high bar is not always necessary.
Interesting. Which, and by the way, I think that you made that point earlier on, which is, I think that what you mentioned earlier on was that the answer that you may receive is, it may not be 100% correct, and that's what you're saying, right? Which is, the bar doesn't have to be all the way up here necessarily.
Yes, as long as we can provide a way for users to know what to do, right? Because if I see transparency in in auditing, where is the data coming from? What assumptions did the tool make when answering my question? What choices did it make? What business rules did it employ? How do you express that and expose it to the user in a way that they can see, oh, I can see what's wrong here. Going back to the Netflix examples, I can say, oh, yes, you assumed that I meant French language movies, but I actually meant movies directed by a French director. Let me correct you and guide you so that you can remember that for the future.
I would almost describe it as for both forward and backward context. In other words, and I think the easiest way for people to understand this is when they do the deep reasoning button on ChatGPT, for example, before it goes to start the deep research, it'll ask you a series of questions, probably because it's so expensive for it to do that, and OpenAI doesn't want you doing that multiple times. But it'll ask you contextual questions that is necessary for it to go out and do its deep research. So it does that before it goes out and provides the answer. But I think what you're mentioning is the backward context. So if a user receives an answer, they should also have the ability to understand what context went into providing that answer.
You're 100% right. And they're not mutually exclusive, by the way. In fact, we champion both approaches. We champion both, where you're no longer talking about the difference between being a passive consumer versus being an active participant. It's like me going up to the counter and saying, I want a sandwich, and then just waiting for my sandwich to arrive, versus now actually I'm right there with the cook, and I'm saying, this is how I like my meat, and no mayo, please. But how do you do that in a way that is not overwhelming and intimidating to a non-data expert, and they can become part of that process?
I like that. So that is actually a really good bridge into the next question, because I was going to ask you, well, then how are analytics, Gen AI, and decision support, how are these all converging now within these platforms?
I think we're right in the middle of that. I think you see all of those converging in very different ways depending on where you're looking. I think that AI gives us the opportunity to finally build solutions that speak the language of the business. And I'm going to make a very broad and maybe unfair generalization. I'm sure there are exceptions to this, but we keep a very close eye on the industry. We're tracking a lot of vendors that are trying to enter into this space. And I invite you to go look at the demos that a lot of analytics vendors are putting out there, where they're showing the AI capabilities. You still see a lot of the language of data model, right? Where they're putting chatbots on top of data, but those chatbots are still expecting that more highly structured or semi-structured language in order to understand what the user means. And they still expect sort of that front-loaded work of building semantic definitions behind the scenes before the business can get any value. It's, again, there's exceptions, but we do see a lot of approaches that are perpetuating the old model of analytics. And I think the winning flavor of conversions is going to be the one that understands that we are in a completely new world now, that functions are changing, that jobs are changing, call it what you will, vibe analytics or another term, right? It is a very interesting new world where it's not just about, hey, let's optimize and make analytics more efficient than it was before, but rather it's about let's completely break apart and reinvent the experience from the ground up. So I don't know which model of conversions is going to win because I think you're seeing different ones. I think the one that we're championing is the one that says we're just going to start from the ground up and invent a completely new model for people to interact with data using AI.
Well, Pedro, given that convergence, what can we expect to see from analytical platforms over the next 3 to 5 years?
This is going to be a really bold prediction. I think we're going to see the market flipped again. I see a lot of the same signs that we saw whenever it was 15 years ago when Tableau apparently came out of nowhere, and tools like Tableau and Click just flipped the market and pushed the traditional leaders back then, Business Objects, Cognos, MicroStrategy, out of those leadership positions. Now, they really didn't come out of nowhere. They had been building this very passionate customer base right under their noses for years, right? But the key was that they were addressing a segment of the market that had been neglected for years. And I think that's going to be key to who wins in this next generation of analytics, who's capable of identifying that underserved segment of the market. So what I expect we're going to see is you're going to see new entrants. Some of them are going to bring generative AI, but still applying that old paradigm of BI. And they're just going to go head to head with incumbents that have a 20-year head start on them, and good luck. And then you're going to see tools that seemingly come out of nowhere, but they really hadn't. They've just been building up their customer base, their product maturity, and their business over years. And they're going to become the new leaders. So yes, I do predict that you're going to see companies choosing completely new tools that you probably are not familiar with today. We hope Walabi becomes one of those tools, of course. But even if it's not Walabi, you're going to see new names take over those leadership spots. And just like you saw with the Gen 1 tools, you're going to see those Gen 2 leaders become relegated to follower positions.
Pedro, how should vendors be thinking about, or should I say rethinking about, the way that they deliver value to customers?
Understand who you're trying to deliver value to. We are very big on this idea of democratizing analytics and empowering end users with self-service. And for the most part, the industry as a whole has failed to do that. We've always still built tools that are designed for data people. If we truly want to break beyond that, cited 25% adoption rate, you're going to need a very new approach. So I think vendors who are successful are going to have to be building for a very different audience that thinks about data in a very different way, that speaks a very different language, and then has very different conceptions of what their work is. If you're building for data teams, you're building for people whose full-time job is data. Like the word data is in their job titles, right? But if you want to reach business teams, right, data is not their full-time job. In fact, they would probably prefer not to be bothered with having to think like they're analyzing data. It'd just be something very natural that's supporting their primary function, not becomes their primary function. And I think some vendors get that and some don't.
It almost, based on what you're saying, it almost sounds like even the buyer demographic then will have to be significantly younger, for lack of a better or worse, so that you have people that are not completely set in their ways. And as you mentioned, thinking about data in that old semantic layer way. Where does Walabi fit in this whole ecosystem?
We are positioning ourselves to become that tool of choice for companies in what we call this new AI economy. Companies that realize that there's a new way to grow, there's a new way to scale, that doesn't involve large capital expenditures, expansive teams, a lot of in-house expertise, like the companies that are on that AI native leaderboard that I mentioned, but also established companies that see that model and adopt it and say, oh, okay, so there's a new way to compete there. And ultimately what that does is it levels the playing field. So smaller companies can actually compete more effectively against the larger, better funded players. Our goal is to help all those companies that haven't had that ability to do so before be able to finally use their data to compete and grow smarter and faster. So that's our vision for Walabi. Our goal is to go after that holy grail of analytics and finally break through that adoption barrier and reach people that really haven't been served adequately by analytics in the past.
You got me really excited with one of the things that you mentioned, which was the example of how tools like Tableau disrupted the market, where back in the day, it used to be an entire semantic layer, right? I mean, we were building out metadata for months before anyone could actually even see a report, let alone a dashboard. And I agree with you 100% that, it seems like Tableau came out of nowhere, for example, when they said, hey, listen, you can just build right on top of tables without a semantic layer. And you got me excited about Walabi because you mentioned, well, this is going to take that one step even further. If I am an analytics leader and I'm very excited about what I'm hearing, what are some very practical next steps that you would give to me, that you would tell me right now to say, how can I get started then with AI enhanced analytics?
I always say the same thing is the first step, is not a technology step. It's not a product step. It's a business question. You have to really be very crisp about your business goals. Be able to define your business goals very clearly. What problem are you trying to solve as a data leader? Are you trying to be more successful with end user self-service? Are you looking to optimize your back-end data management processes? And then as you start getting into looking at tools that can support this, understand that not all AI-based analytics tools are the same. Like any vendor can add an AI chatbot or a co-pilot experience to their business, but that doesn't really mean that they fundamentally change the data analysis experience in a way that's going to meaningfully alter the way that your data team works or the benefit that your end users receive. You could still be employing an old school BI approach, but now it's wearing like an LLM disguise. So there is, as with any technology disruption, a lot of noise out there, and AI is the thing that everybody's talking about, but not all AI approaches are the same. So I think that's very important for data leaders to understand that what am I trying to solve and what's the tool that best aligns with that challenge that I have.
What you just mentioned, I like it because the word that comes to mind is AI from the ground up is what Walabi is. And it's a completely different philosophical approach to analytics. It kind of reminds me of when Amazon first came out with e-commerce, if you will, and people thought, oh, I just need to stick a website on top of my company, and now I'm a web-based company, right? And I think that's kind of what you're saying, which is it's significantly different when you build it with AI from the ground up, where not only the technology changes, but as a result of the new technology, the philosophical approach to analytics also changes. I think people are super duper excited to learn a little bit more about Walabi. Can you tell us how listeners can go to learn more about Walabi?
Yes, and thank you for the opportunity to share that. So you can go to our website, walabi.ai. You can get in touch with us there. You can follow the Walabi page on LinkedIn. Please do so. We love that engagement. Connect with me directly. I love connecting with people in the data space, or if you're part of the marketing ops profession, we love connecting with you too. And happy to answer questions, share perspectives, and would love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pedro. And thank you to all of our listeners for dialing in. Hopefully this was very educational for you. I know that it definitely was for me. I think, Pedro, you got me really excited about this transformation that's happening within our industry. And I'm actually very excited to go jump on your page right after this podcast. So thank you very much, everyone. Talk to you guys later.
Thank you, Marvin.